it. Today we're going to do a line of argument explained. This is one of the main things that many of my learners really struggle with is building that line of argument. And a lot of them, you teach them how to do it, and then what ends up happening is they keep repeating the same thing over and over, and then they get a problem with repetition. So the line of argument really is what separates a 35 out of 50 from a 50 out of 50. The better the line of the argument, the better the mark. So let's see how we can stay on track with our arguments. So firstly, what is a line of argument? A line of argument is basically the thread of reasoning that runs through your essay, which links every single paragraph to the main idea of the essay. I'm going to show you an example of that in a moment. But basically, if you think of yourself like a lawyer, like whenever I do a history essay, I always make the example. Think of yourself like a lawyer. It's not enough to just give the evidence. You have to explain how the evidence answers the question. And that step of explaining how the evidence answers the question, that is what we can refer to as a line of argument. So it's the logical stepping stones, basically getting from your introduction to your conclusion. So if you're in your introduction, you're saying, yes, I agree, then the next step is showing how you agree in the actual essay. And then your conclusion will see, you see, I've proven to you that I agree with the statement. So what's the 5 steps to a strong line of argument? Step 1, state your position clearly. So in the introduction, you're going to take your stance. So if they ask you to agree, you're going to say, I agree, I disagree. To a great extent, to a certain extent, to a lesser extent. This essay will critically discuss whatever. So your stance needs to be obvious in the introduction so that the examiner immediately knows what to look out for as they are reading through your essay. Next step is to plan your paragraphs. Each one should connect directly to your main argument. So if you are saying, yes, I agree, that means in paragraph 1, 2, 3, and 4, you are going to show your agreement in every single paragraph and how it relates to the main argument. Next step is to use your evidence wisely. So you can't just say, I was actually marking an essay today where the learner, it was on Black consciousness, and the learner would say the BPC installed pride and self-confidence in Black South Africans. Then they said the next paragraph, they said the Bawu installed pride and confidence in Black South Africans, but the how was missing. So the learner was telling me there was this organization, there was this organization, there was this organization, but they weren't explaining exactly how did these organizations instill people with pride and confidence. It's not enough to just say that they instilled people with pride and confidence. You need to show me how did they do that. Next, we have to link back every time. So by the end of each paragraph, you tie it to your argument. So you can think of it like what do they call that thing? A boomerang. You're always going back to the question, back to the answer, looking at those keywords from the question, using it in your paragraph, showing how your paragraph is answering the question. Last sentence always ties back to your argument. And then when you do your conclusion, you have to summarize how everything you've spoken about so far proves the position that you took in the introduction. So if you want to have a strong line of argument, please remember to follow these steps. State your position clearly, plan your paragraphs, use evidence wisely, and link back every time and conclude with impact. So let's have a look at a practical example of how an argument will change based on the question. So this is 3 essay questions from past papers. Don't ask me which ones. I got this from a history teacher's guide that was sent to history teachers, drawn up by the curriculum advisors. So you can maybe ask your history teacher if they have access to that. And then we can go over here. Of course, I'm in the Western Cape, so this is probably only in Western Cape, but I'm sure if you are in Gauteng or another province, they will be able to tell you which let me just take a red something similar. All right, so let's have a look here. Do that. Don't make this go away. Okay, so Black Americans adopted the Black Power philosophy to instill pride and self-reliance in themselves to challenge discrimination against them, right? And then this question is, do you agree? Then if we look at the other question, let me take this color. This one says they adopted a militant approach to challenge discrimination. We're speaking specifically about the 1960s, and we have to critically discuss. And then the last one says, to what extent role players, so I'm going to be talking about the role players. I'm going to talk about whether they were successful in ending discrimination. So you see, all of these questions are dealing with Black power, but the way the question is asked is slightly different every single time. So how would our argument therefore change? So the first step that you need to do is you need to underline the question words in the argument, like we've done. And that is what we're going to use to build our line of argument. So when we get to our paragraphs, for example, with the first question, we're going to speak about instilling pride, instilling self-reliance, and challenging discrimination. When we speak about the second one, our focus is going to change. We're not going to speak about the pride and self-reliance. We're going to speak about the militant approach that was used and how the militant approach challenged discrimination. And then with the last one, you see, you have to speak about the role players. So now you're going to speak about Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, and whether these role players were successful to end discrimination. So remember, these ones, the previous two is about challenging discrimination, but the last one is asking about ending discrimination. So did they actually end the discrimination? That's what it's asking. So every time you get a question, you need to adapt the content to fit the question. And what a lot of learners do is they pre-prepare an essay, they have a model essay, and the model essay doesn't answer what the question is actually asking you to do. So just be aware of that. So here's an example for the first one. The question was, Black Americans adopted the Black Power philosophy to instill pride and self-reliance in themselves to challenge discrimination against them in the US. Do you agree? So your point is going to be the BPM started because African Americans wanted to fight against unfair treatment and build pride and independence in their communities. My evidence is going to be in the 1960s, they lived in poor housing, they had bad healthcare and schools, and they faced high unemployment. Many also felt that Martin Luther King Jr.'s peaceful marches were too slow to bring change. They're going to explain that evidence. Black Power encouraged African Americans to control their own communities, start their own programs, and be proud of their heritage to fight discrimination. And now your link is what is your line of argument here. You'll see I've underlined the keywords from the question. So let me just go back here to the question. You see pride, you see self-reliance. Black Americans adopted the Black Power philosophy to instill pride and self-reliance. And then I go here. And then you look at the link, it says, so many supported Black Power because it gave them hope for real change through pride and self-reliance. So this one then directly answers what the question is asking me. This is example 2. The question was, the Black Power movement adopted a militant approach to challenge discrimination in the USA in the 1960s. You had to critically discuss it. So the point would be the Black Power movement grew because African Americans were tired of the slow progress and they wanted stronger action against discrimination. So some groups became more militant. So what do you see there? The word militant, same like the question. I've used it in my point. So that is me starting off the line of argument. So now I give my evidence for that. I say they lived in poor housing, low quality healthcare and education, high unemployment, Martin Luther King Jr.'s peaceful methods, not enough. And then my explanation, some Black Power groups, like the Black Panthers, believed in self-defense and protecting their community. So that's speaking to the idea of militancy. They also ran food and health programs, showing that militancy was about more than violence. Then my link, my line of argument, this shows the militant side of Black Power was a reaction to the continued suffering, but not all Black Power supporters used violence. So the food and the health clinics and things like that is not necessarily a militant approach. However, the self-defense, the protecting your community, that would be more militant. Example 3, explain to what extent various role players were successful in using the Black Power philosophy to end discrimination. So my point, Black Power movement began to fight unfair treatment and improve life for the African Americans with leaders and groups using Black Power ideas in many different ways. So leaders and groups is speaking to the role players. In my evidence, I'm going to say in the 1960s, they faced poor housing, bad schools and healthcare, and high unemployment. The dissatisfaction with Martin Luther King's nonviolent approach pushed figures like Stokely Carmichael. So Stokely Carmichael is a role player, and groups like Black Panthers. Black Panthers is a role player to promote self-reliance, pride, and community control. Then explain what did these role players do? These groups inspired people and gave them a stronger identity. They created community projects, but they could not fully end poverty or discrimination in the short time they had. So remember, it's a to what extent question. So I'm looking at both where they were successful and where they were unsuccessful. So my link is now going to bring that back to the question. So they were successful in inspiring pride and action, but only partly successful in ending discrimination completely. So that answers the question to what extent. So they inspired pride and action, but they didn't end discrimination completely. And you see how that ties back to the question. So how does the argument shift between these three questions? Firstly, line of argument. In pride and self-reliance, yes, I have to have Black Power promoted cultural pride, self-determination, and community control. With the military approach one, I have my line of argument changes. Now I say militancy existed, for example, with the Black Panthers, but the movement also included other programs like education and economic programs. And then the success and limits of the actual movement itself, whether it could end, it's partial. I can say that it inspired change in some circumstances, but it didn't fully dismantle systemic racism in the 1960s. So now I go to the key emphasis in this line of argument. For the first one is going to be empowerment. So when I use words like Black is beautiful, Afrocentrism, I'm speaking about that cultural pride, I'm speaking about that self-determination, and I'm speaking about that community control. When I go to the militant approach one and I look at the key emphasis, I need to make a distinction between the armed patrols and the free breakfast program. So the actual militant things that they are doing, like carrying weapons, policing the police, Black Panthers with their black uniforms and things like that. And then the community work being kind of separate from that, being the free breakfast program to help people in the community. And then the key emphasis with the success versus limits argument is going to be what was their long-term impacts and their short-term impacts. So yes, we had pride growing. People took pride in their hairstyles. They stopped using skin bleach and things like that. But the actual ending of discrimination was because of laws like the Civil Rights Act, which was from the Civil Rights Movement and not from the Black Power movement. What is your tone going to be like when you do this argument? You're going to focus on identity and independence in the one that's about pride and self-reliance. With a militant approach, you need to acknowledge both sides. So you need to acknowledge they were militant here, and here they were more in line with helping the community. And with the success versus limits, you need to actually judge the evidence. So you have to look at all their achievements on an individual level and basically say, okay, this was successful, this was unsuccessful, this was successful, this was unsuccessful. And you have to follow that throughout the entire essay. So tips and tricks to building a line of argument. This is what you're actually here for, actually. So every paragraph should connect directly to your main stance. So you use the keywords from the question to do so. So if you go to the question and it uses words like self-reliance, if it uses words like militant, if it uses words like success, use those words in your paragraph because that is showing a line of argument. Next, you must use PEEL. This keeps your argument connected to the question at all times. And then when you get that last sentence, the L, I just a heads up to highlight it or well, okay, not highlight it, underline it with a pencil or a pen, just so that you can see this is what links this paragraph back to the question. Then you have to show both sides, but keep steering back to your chosen position. And this is especially for those critically discussed or to what extent questions where sometimes there's something there that doesn't really fit the question. Especially sometimes when they ask, do you agree? And you're writing something that is disagree. So, do you believe that the Black Power movement was successful in ending discrimination? And then you're writing about all the achievements, but you know that they didn't end discrimination. So, now how do you adapt that line of argument? Now you need to actually say that, okay, they managed to achieve this. Just because they didn't end discrimination doesn't mean they didn't achieve anything at all. And that is how you're going to bring that evidence back to your argument. So just be aware of that. I don't know if you're following what I'm saying there, but always steer back to your chosen position, even if you're saying something that is not in line with what you said in your introduction. So if in your introduction you're saying to a great extent, and then there's something in the essay that is to a lesser extent, then you just kind of make sure that your line of argument proves the impact that that thing had. And remember, last thing, a strong conclusion equals a strong line of argument. All right, so in conclusion, if your marker can work out what the question is just by reading your paragraphs and sum up your essay argument in one sentence, then you've pretty much nailed it. You've got that line of argument. So I hope this helps you when you are compiling your essays. Please remember that you can't come into a history exam with a pre-written essay because you have no idea what that question is. You do know based on past trends what the focus is going to be on, probably on challenging or ending discrimination, but you can't predict the exact question word for word. So you know that certain keywords are going to pop up. Make sure that you use those keywords throughout your essay's argument in order to build a good and independent or original line of argument. All right, I hope this helps you, and I'll see you next time. If you have any ideas for another video, you can just drop it in the comments below. Thank you.